So say a little bit more now. Tell us the ID 2020 story. What is 2020? Why
Sure.
2020? Does that mean we get it all done by 2020?
Yeah.
And what does it look like?
So we're probably not going to get it all done by 2020, although I'd like to believe we could. Sorry, the slides may be jumping around a little bit. So there are 1.1 billion people globally with no form of identification. So they've had no birth certificate, they have no passport, no driver's license. And as you can imagine, that profoundly limits their ability to engage in the modern economy. You can't open a bank account, you can't vote, you can't do any of the sort of things that you and I take for granted, even enroll your child in primary school, get access to basic education. And I think for a long time, the challenge to scaling up identity was that we were trying to deliver a paper-based service, and we were trying to do so in countries and in systems that were already stressed to the greatest extent possible. And what we see is that paper-based solutions aren't the answer anymore. A lot of these individuals are living their lives online, and that's true even in markets that are developing economies. And so what we really are thinking about is digital identity. How do we provide somebody with a digital means to prove who they are that is persistent, that's portable? That's a new concept. While you and I have had usernames and passwords and use that to kind of navigate the world, digital identity is sort of as a broader concept is really only emerging now. And so what we've set for 2020 is proof of concept at scale, sort of with significant partners, such that we're in a place to scale that up by 2030 to reach the SDG 16.9, which is legal identity for all by 2030.
Okay, so it rolls up to that SDG. That makes sense. So what a persistent digital identity, a lot to unpack there. Before we go there, though, talk a little bit about why is this hard? So what are the challenges to scaling something like this? These are really big numbers. Obviously, it's not an easy thing to do, or a lot of governments or others would have figured out how to do more of it. What do you need to achieve, and what are the plans for hitting the biggest barriers?
Sure. So I'm going to try and use a slide. I apologize, guys, they're a little bit out of order, but so 1.1 billion people without a legal identity, like I said. And I attribute that largely to this. This is a problem in our minds of market failure. While technology enables us to provide someone a digital identity, the sort of current ways that we think about funding identity are a complete mess. The thing that we found in looking at this, and identity is a relatively new term in the development community, but we've long played roles in providing various pieces of this, whether that's birth registration, voter registration, registration of a refugee, et cetera. And the flow of funds that we've created to fund all those different projects looks, you have the US government funding, 4 different international organizations, all of whom then direct money to different institutions in country who then all fund different programs. And this is replicated across every single country, with the result being that these funding streams actually incentivize the creation of siloed, non-interoperable systems. That's where we need to focus if we're going to have impact. And I actually think it ties back to what we heard earlier, that you have to act your way into a new way of thinking. We can't continue to fund things this way and expect that we create a solution that is more useful for individuals. For digital identity to be useful, and I keep returning to this, it's really important that it's something that's persistent and portable, right? You imagine a refugee fleeing from Syria, they cross a border, perhaps they didn't have time to find their identity documents, perhaps that was a risk factor as they fled and they chose intentionally not to keep those documents on them. But then imagine them arriving in a host country or refugee camp with nothing to prove who they are. And sort of the current experience of a refugee in that situation is that they're interviewed ceaselessly by all the various institutions which they then interact, whether that's the UN systems, the NGOs, the host government, et cetera. It's as you'd imagine, a really traumatizing experience. And I think it highlights sort of the complexity of what we're trying to solve, right? We need a solution that somebody can use verifiably, that maintains their privacy so that as they flee, if they didn't want to be exposed, they had the potential to do that. And when they arrive, that people will trust. And to do that requires, like you said, a really expansive ecosystem. There are the tech companies that bring sort of relevant technical pieces to the puzzle, but we also need governments involved. We need non-tech companies who are, perhaps the future employers, who, if somebody's in your supply chain, this can be a benefit to you, and that then you can have that true visibility into who lives at the sort of furthest reaches of your supply chain. We need the organizations, the Gavis, the UNHCRs, others, who have breadth and reach and trust with these populations. And I think what's interesting is that because, and I can go into some of the technical details, but because we can create a technical system now that doesn't really care how you enter the system. Somebody could initiate a digital identity through interactions with their employer, or through their government, or through a trusted NGO, or a faith-based organization in their community. It's somewhat agnostic. They could even do it themselves. And that's a really powerful thing in saying, people suddenly then have far more control over their identities, and they can trust the system that much more. The potential privacy risks if digital identity is done thoughtlessly are enormous. And I think there's actually something that we're watching very closely sort of in the space right now, where the sense is that digital identity is coming. It's not sort of a if, it's a when. And that conversation can either be led from a human rights perspective, or it can be led from a, how do we enable, sort of the greatest profits or the greatest control. And so that's, I think that's really where, in our work with some of the UN agencies, et cetera, where they're coming from, saying how do we ensure that we get out ahead of some of these new technical trends and ensure that it's done well. Essentially, the logic at the time was that there was lots of funding currently going into, this is relating to Gavi, lots of funding going into the global health landscape, but the funding was following really sort of circuitous streams of funds. And as a result, the ministries of health and whatnot in these developing countries were unable to scale up immunization and other programs that were seen to be cost effective. And the logic of sort of Bill Gates and others in founding Gavi was saying, if we can correct that flow of funds, we can suddenly then change the incentives, and we can do so in a way that makes it possible for these governments to scale up the programs. Like I said, Gavi funds the 73 poorest countries in the world, which collectively have 60% of the world's kids. And if you imagine it as a pharma manufacturer in that sort of previous world, that was 60% of the world's population that you'd been unable to sell into. And so the pharma companies for the vaccine market essentially have only been focusing on 40% of the world's population. And what this group hypothesized was, we can essentially make the market economics work so that we can fund vaccination for the entire world's population, and it creates a functional business for pharma. We think there's something very similar here, right? When we've got a flow of funds that looks like this, there's no market that makes sense, and it's really difficult for companies and organizations to get involved. And so what we've done is say, in part, we need to create an alliance that's an open, very clear governance structure, right? So there's transparency in thinking through a lot of these questions, so that the relevant stakeholders, whether that's the UN agencies, national governments, companies, et cetera, have a venue to discuss some of these really genuinely thorny conversations, but also that we can then create a pool of funding that allows for investment in systems that are far better both for the end users and for the purposes of sort of ensuring access to services. And what that does is then that creates a functional market on top of it. And so we're actually genuinely really excited that this is something that can be a business opportunity for the many different partners that we bring to the fold. I think that almost the short-term rationale for many of the companies that we've been partnering with, and Microsoft and Accenture have both been sort of early founding partners, has largely been around supply chain. And I think particularly for Microsoft and others, they sort of say, to look out at the furthest reaches of our supply chain is genuinely really difficult right now. You can sort of disaggregate down to a certain point, but it's often very difficult to get down to the actual individual. And so if you can create a system that provides access to those individuals and empowers them, that is really compelling. I think the other piece is that the organizations that we're working with see how digital identity is relevant both for these very vulnerable populations and for you or I. This is one interesting example, but Accenture looked at the model of what we were trying to create and said, we currently finance, when any one of our consultants is sent to a new financial sector institution, we pay for yet another background check. It's just a required sort of pro forma thing that they do every time a consultant is sent to a new site. If there's a verifiable way to ensure that these people are who they say they are and they bring the credentials that they might, that can solve an enormous business problem for us. And so Accenture is actually talking about how they can take exactly the same relevant technology and turn around and use that for something inside their own business.
In terms of the capabilities that the Alliance most needs now, so funding I'll take for granted, would always be nice. What are some of the capabilities you'd like to see added to the network? I think you mentioned security and some other things.
Yeah, so I think security is certainly one of them. I think we have sort of some strong technical voices, would always take more. But I think that the place that I'm most enthusiastic are about some of the organizations with these really massive supply chains who can provide almost an alternate lens and a different way to reach people where they are. And so if you have a really big supply chain, I want to talk. But I think that the perspective of sort of how do we engage with these communities that we oftentimes we only know of through sort of a government lens is a really important and sort of needed piece of the conversation. There are countries that are immunizing vastly more children than we register, and that's, to me, a tremendous opportunity. And so if we can figure out how sort of early in life, when that child is in the hands of a trusted caretaker, we can provide them with sort of the early starting points for digital identity, that is something that...
So just link it to the immunization.
Yeah, something we're really excited about.
Hi, I'm Martha Rabor from the UN Foundation. First of all, thank you so much for your insight and talk about Gavi. I had up a campaign, Shot at Life, where we work very closely with Gavi. And you answer my question a little bit, but I know there's a lot of challenges around refugee populations or just, large movement trying to figure out if children have been immunized or not. And I'm thinking that what you're working on could be a solution. I know a lot of times they're just immunize again. There's some immunizations that aren't harmful, and then at least you have populations covered because of the refugee settings and the close proximity. A disease like measles could be catastrophic. So I just love to hear a little bit more the work that you're doing with Gavi and using digital immunization records.
Sure, that's a perfect example. And I think really does illustrate why we need to think of digital identity not just for refugee populations once they've maybe arrived in the point of in the host country, but how we reach people really early in life. Because the truth is that we don't know, when any of us could be displaced. And so, figuring out how we reach broad swaths of the population early in life ensures that they get the protective benefits of this, sort of no matter what might happen. In terms of the work specifically with Gavi, it really does center on this notion that we are immunizing children who we don't know about in any other formal way. We estimate that 98% of children receive one dose of something. So, while only 86% of children are receiving the third dose of the DTP3 vaccine, most children on the planet are receiving one dose of something, and that's just a tremendous opportunity. Is that good to cover? Cool.
And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth, by the means of those miracles which he had power to do, in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand, or in their foreheads. And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding, count the number of the beast. For it is the number of the man. And his number is 666.